Good morning. Today I'm going to be reading from the fifth book of the Left Behind series. The name of the book is called Apollyon, and I'm going to be reading chapter 19 today. And I'll begin to read. Rayford loved his daughter with all that was in him. He always had. It wasn't just because she was the only family he had left. He had loved Ramey too, and still missed him terribly. Losing two wives in fewer than 3 years was a blow he knew would be with him until Jesus came again. But his relationship with Chloe had always been special. They'd had their moments, of course, when she was going through the process of breaking away from the family and becoming an independent young woman. Yet she was so much like him. That had made it difficult for her to believe that God was behind the disappearances in the first place. Flattered that she took after him, and yet afraid her practicality might forever keep her from Christ, Rayford had agonized over her. The greatest day of his life, excluding when he himself became a believer, was when Chloe made her decision. He was thrilled when she and Buck married, despite the 10-year age difference. He didn't know what he thought when he heard they were expecting and that he would be a grandfather with fewer than 5 years left on the earth. But seeing Chloe in the full bloom of her pregnancy, he was transported. He remembered Irene, despite difficult pregnancies, looking radiant the further she progressed, and yes, the bigger she got. He had read all the books, knew the pitfalls. Rayford understood that Irene would not believe him when he said she was most beautiful when she was very pregnant. She had said the same thing Chloe was saying now, that she felt like a cow, a barn, a barge. She hated the swollen joints, the sore back, the shortness of breath, and the lack of mobility. In a way, I'm glad Buck is stuck in Israel, she said. I mean, I want him back, and I want him back now, but he's going to think I've doubled in size. Rayford took the occasion to sit with Chloe. Sweetheart, he said, indulge me. It may be politically incorrect to say that you are doing what you were meant to do. I know you're more than a baby-making machine, and that you have incredible things to offer the world. You made an impact even before the rapture, but since you've been a soldier, you're going to make the World Commodity Co-op a lifesaver for millions of saints. But you need to do me a favor and stop bemoaning what this pregnancy is doing to your body. I know, Daddy, she said, but it's just that I'm so beautiful, he said, absolutely beautiful. He said it with such feeling that it seemed to shut her up. She looked different, of course. Nothing was the same. With only a few weeks until her due date, she was full-faced and ponderous, but he could still detect his little girl there, his Chloe when she had been a toddler, full of life and curiosity. I'm frustrated for Buck that he can't see you like this. Now don't look at me like that. I mean it. He will find you so lovely, and believe it or not, he will find you attractive too. You're not the first mom to be who equates pregnancy with being overweight. Husbands don't think that way. He'll see you the way I saw your mother when she was carrying you. He'll be overcome with the knowledge that you're carrying his and your child. Chloe seemed to appreciate the pep talk. I'm really stressed about him coming home, she said. I know he's leaving Israel at 6 this time, but who knows how long he'll be in Greece. Not long. He wants to get home. And it being a charter, they'll keep moving, I think. I wish I could meet him at the airport. Doc says you shouldn't ride in that car, especially on these roads. I know. I don't really want to endure that, but Buck and I have been apart so long, and as much as we worry about bringing a baby into the world at this time in history, we've both grown so attached to this child already that we can't wait to meet him or her. I can't wait to be a grandfather, Rayford said. I've been praying for this child since I knew it existed. I just worry that life is going to be so hard for all of us that I won't get the opportunity to be the kind of grandpa I want to be. You'll be great. I'm glad you're not still flying for Carpathia. I wouldn't want to worry about you all the time. Rayford stood and looked out the window. The morning sun was harsh. I'm getting back into the war, he said. What does that mean? Well, I can blame it on you. You've taken Ken's idea so far that it's going to give me a full time job. I'm going to be flying almost as much as when I was with Pan Con. For the co op? He nodded. I've told you about T. Uh huh. We're going to run the airlift operation out of Milwaukee. I'll be flying all over the world. If those fishermen in the Bering Strait are as successful as you seem to think they'll be, I'll have enough business up there to last till the glorious appearing. Floyd Charles knocked on the door jamb. Time for a little checkup. You want Dad to wait outside? What are we doing? Chloe said. Just checking heartbeats, yours and Junior's. He can stay, can't he listen? Sure. Floyd took Chloe's pulse first, then listened to her heart with the stethoscope. He spread lubricating jelly on her protruding belly and used a battery powered monitor to amplify the liquid sounds of the fetal heartbeat. Rayford fought tears and Chloe beamed. Sounds like a big boy to me, Doc, Charles said. As he finished up, Chloe asked, Everything still fine? No major problems, he said. Rayford glanced at Floyd. He was not as light as usual. He had not even smiled when he joked about her having a boy. She didn't want to know the sex of the baby, and he had never tested to find out. How about other than major problems, Floyd? She said, her voice flat. You usually say everything's great. She had spoken exactly what was on Rayford's mind, and his heart sank when Floyd pulled up a chair. You noticed that, did you? He said. Oh, no, she said. Floyd put a hand on her shoulder. Chloe, listen to me. Oh, no. Chloe, what did I say? I said no major problems, and I meant it. Do you think I would say that if it wasn't true? So, what's the minor problem? Some reduction in the baby's pulse. You're kidding, Rayford said. If I'd had to guess, I would have said it sounded too fast. All fetal pulses are faster than ours, Floyd said, and the reduction is so slight that I can hardly give it a second thought. Last week. This has been going on for a week, Chloe said. Floyd nodded. We're talking about a fraction of a percentage decrease in 6 days. It doesn't have to mean anything. But if it means anything, Chloe said, what would it mean? We don't want to see an actual slowdown of the fetal pulse, like 5%, especially 10% or more, because that could mean some threat to viability. English doctor, Chloe said. As the baby gets into position for birth, the umbilical cord could tighten around the chest or the neck. Do you think that's happening? No, I'm just watching heart rate, Chloe. That's all. Is it a possibility? Anything is a possibility. That's why I'm not listing everything that could go wrong. If this is so minor, why are you telling me? For one thing, you asked. I just want to prepare you for a form of treatment should the symptoms persist. But you said the reduction in rate right now is not worth worrying about. Okay, if the symptoms get worse, what would you do? At least get you an oxygen for the better part of each day. I need to stand up a minute, Chloe said. She started to move and Rayford reached to help. Floyd didn't. Actually, he said, I prefer that you take it very easy until I can get out and get you some oxygen tomorrow. I can't even stand up for necessities. If it's just to shift position, try not to. All right, she said. My dad and I are bottom line people. Give me the worst case scenario. I've dealt with enough pregnant women, especially at this stage of gestation, to know it's not best to dwell on all the negative possibilities. I'm not pregnant. I'm not pregnant woman, Doc. I'm Chloe, and you know me, and you know I'm going to bug you to death until you tell me the worst case. All right, he said, I see the oxygen solving the problem. If it doesn't, I'll have you on monitors around the clock to warn of a significant change in fetal pulse. Worst case, we might want to induce labor. It might mean a cesarean section because of the likelihood of an umbilical cord problem. Chloe felt silent and looked at Rayford. He said, You don't like to induce, right? Of course not. I used to say nature knows best, that baby comes when he is ready. Now I know that God knows best, but he has also given us brains and miracle medicines and technologies that allow us to do what we need to do when things don't go the way we wish. Chloe looked uncomfortable. I need to know one thing, Floyd. Did I contribute to this? Was there something I should have done or something I should have not done? Floyd shook his head. I wasn't wild about your going to Israel, and if I never hear again about you running from helicopter to jet, it'll be too soon. But overexertion at that stage of pregnancy would have shown up in different problems, such as nothing that turned up, so I'm not going to talk about it. How's that? You've already been through all the predictable stuff, convinced you're going to have a monster, convinced the baby has already died, certain your baby doesn't have all its parts. You don't need to worry about stuff you might have caused but didn't. Now, when do you expect Papa? Sometime tonight, she said. That's all I know. Abdullah Smith seemed pleased that Buck showed up when he said he would. I heard you were a man of your word, Buck said, and wanted to show that I am too. Abdullah, as usual, did not respond. He grabbed one of Buck's bags and led him briskly toward his plane. Buck tried to guess which one it would be. He passed the prop jobs, knowing they would never get him across the Atlantic. But Abdullah also passed a Learjet and a brand new Hodgeman, a smaller version of the Concorde, and just as fast. Buck stopped and stared when Abdullah pulled back the plexiglass cockpit shield of what he recognized as an Egyptian fighter jet. It would fly nearly 2,000 miles an hour at very high altitudes, but had to have a shorter than usual fuel range. This is your plane, Buck said. Pleased to board, Abdullah said. Fuel tank enlarged, small cargo hold added. Stop in Greece, stop in London, stop in Greenland, stop in Wheeling. Buck was impressed that he knew where he was going. It was clear his hope of stretching out, getting some reading done, even dozing, was not in his cards. Passenger must board first, Abdullah said. Buck climbed in and tried to show that he knows his way around this type of craft after having done a series of articles and ride-alongs with American fighter pilots. That was before the sign of Nicola Carpathia and the wholesale marketing of such surplus craft to private citizens. Buck was about to strap on his helmet and oxygen mask when Abdullah sighed and said, Belt. Buck was sitting on it. So much for showing off. He had to stand as much as one could in that confined space, while Abdullah reached beneath him to retrieve the belt. Once strapped in, he tried to put the helmet on. Again, the pilot had to assist, untangling his straps, twisting the helmet just so, and smacking it on top until it settled into corrected, extremely right position. It pressed against Buck's temples and cheekbones. He started to put the mouthpiece in until Abdullah reminded him not until high altitude. Right, I knew that. Abdullah fit just ahead of him, giving Buck the feeling they were on a lug. Abdullah's head just inches from Buck's nose. Taking a jet fighter from a staging area out onto the tarmac into line and then out onto the runway would have taken up to half an hour in the States. Buck learned that in Amman. The airport was like the street market. No lines or queues. It was first come, first served, and you were on your own. Abdullah sang something into the radio about jet, charter, passenger, cargo, and Greece, all while moving the fighter directly onto the runway. He didn't wait for instructions from ground control. The Amman airport had only recently reopened after rebuilding, and while air traffic was down because of the plague of locusts, several flights were lined up. Two wide bodies sat at the front of the line, followed by a standard jet, a Lear jet, and another big plane. Abdullah turned to get Buck's attention and pointed to the fuel gauge, which showed full. Buck gave a thumbs up sign, which he intended to imply that he felt good about having lots of fuel. Abdullah apparently took it to mean that Buck wanted to get into the air, and now. He taxied quickly around other planes, reached the line of craft cleared, and in line for takeoff, and passed them one by one. Buck was speechless. He imagined if the other pilots had horns, they'd have been honking, like drivers in traffic do to those who ride the shoulder. As Abdullah passed the second wide body, the first began to roll. Abdullah slipped in behind it, and suddenly he and Buck were next in line. Buck craned his neck to see if emergency vehicles were coming for whether the other planes would just pull ahead and get back in their original order. No scolding came from the tower. As soon as the big jet was well on its way down the runway, Abdullah pulled out. Edward Zula Zula, 2-9er, taking off, tower, he said into the radio. Buck fully expected someone to come back with, just where do you think you're going, young man? But no one did. 10-4, Abdullah, was all he heard. There was no warming up and little building speed. Abdullah drove the fighter to the end of the runway, lined her up, and punched it. Buck's head was driven back and his stomach flattened. He could not have leaned forward if he wanted to. Clearly breaking every rule of international aviation, Abdullah reached takeoff speed in a few hundred yards and was airborne. He rocketed above and beyond the jet in front of him, and Buck felt as if they were flying straight up. He was pressed back in his seat, staring at clouds. It seemed only minutes later Abdullah reached the apex of his climb, and just like that, he seemed to throttle back and start his descent. It was like a roller coaster ride, blasting to the peak and then rolling down the other side. Abdullah mashed a button that allowed him to speak directly into Buck's headset. And man, to Athens, just up and down, he said. But we're not going to Athens, remember? Abdullah smacked his helmet. Potamus, right. The plane shot straight up. Abdullah dug through a set of rolled up maps and said, no problem. And he was right. Minutes later, he was screaming onto the runway of the small airport. How long with friends, he said, taxiing to the fuel pumps. Rayford reassured Chloe, and they agreed they'd rather Floyd tell the truth than sugarcoat it and run into problems later. But after he brought her water, Rayford moved upstairs to talk to Tyson. The rabbi welcomed him warmly. Almost finished with my lesson for today, he said. I'll transmit it in an hour or so. Anyway, I always have time for you. Rayford told him of the potential complication with the baby. I will pray, Tyson said, and I will ask you to pray for me as well. Sure, Tyson. Anything specific? Well, yes, frankly. I feel lonely and overwhelmed, and I hate that feeling. It's sure understandable. I know, and I have a deep sense of joy, such as we get when we are in fellowship with the Lord. I have told him this, of course, but I would appreciate knowing somebody else is praying for me too. I'm sure we all do, Tyson. I am most blessed to have such a loving family to replace my loss. We have all suffered. Sometimes it just overtakes me. I knew this locust plague was coming, but I never thought through the ramifications. In many ways, I wish we had been more prepared. Our enemy has been incapacitated for months. Yet while we count on them for so many things like transportation, communications, and the like, this has crippled us too. I don't know, he said, rising and stretching. I don't expect to find happiness anymore. I am looking forward to the birth of this little one as if it were my own. That will bring a ray of sunshine. And we want you to be another parent to it, Tyson. The contrast alone will be sobering, though, won't it? The contrast? This fresh, young innocent will not know why Hattie is crying, won't know of our losses, won't understand that we live in terror, enemies of the state, and there will be no need to teach the little one of all the despair of the past as we would if we were raising it to adulthood. But the time this baby is 5 years old, it will already be living in the millennial kingdom with Jesus Christ in control. Imagine. Tyson had a way of bringing perspective to everything, yet Rayford was sobered by the rabbi's angst. Millions around the world expected Dr. Ben Judah to be their spiritual leader. They had to assume he was at peace with his own mature walk with God. Yet he was a new believer, too. While a great scholar and theologian, he was but a man. Like most others, he had suffered grievously. He still had his days of despair. Rayford began feeling lonely in advance. Floyd would have plenty of doctoring to do in the safe house with a new baby and Hattie still ailing. Buck had told Rayford he looked forward to some modicum of normalcy and permanence so he could make his internet magazine what it needed to be to compete with Carpathia's global community rags. Chloe would be busy with the baby and the details of the commodity co-op, and Hattie, when she finally recuperated, would itch to get out of there. That left Rayford to be the one on the go. He looked forward to being back in the cockpit. He had resigned himself to the fact that his life would consist of hard work, being careful to remain free, and just trying to stay alive. But the glorious appearing seemed farther away all the time. How he longed to be with Jesus, to be reunited with his family. His life was an accomplished commercial pilot, it seemed eons ago now. It was hard to comprehend that it had been fewer than 3 years since he was just a suburban husband and father, and none too good a one, with nothing more to worry about than where and when he was flying next. Rayford couldn't complain of having had nothing important to occupy his time, but the cost of getting to this point, he could empathize with Tyson. If the tribulation was hard on a regular Joe like Rayford, he couldn't imagine what it must be like for one called to rally the 144,000 witnesses and teach maybe a million other new souls. Early in the afternoon, Rayford took a call from T. Delanty. I want to start digging tomorrow, he said. You still willing to help? Wouldn't miss it. If my son-in-law gets in at a decent hour, I'll be ready when you are. How about 7 in the morning? What's the rush? I hear Ernie's getting better. Bo probably would be too, but he tried to kill himself 3 ways. He's a mess. Buy him out. I will, and that will be easy because the way we're set up, all I have to do is make him an offer he can't match. He was left some money, but his share at the airport is so small, I should be able to make him go away. I worry about Ernie. How so? He was close to Ken, Ray, at least as close as a person could hope to get. I know Ken considered him a believer. He had me fooled too. I'm the third stooge on that list, Rayford said. It's possible Ken confided in Ernie. Nah, he only just told me on the flight to Israel. You say that like you guys have been buddies for years. He hardly knew you, Rayford, and yet he told you he buried his gold. I had heard the rumor myself, and I don't feel like I knew Ken well at all. Ernie worked with him, ingratiated him. I don't believe for a second that Ken promised him a thing. That wouldn't make sense. But still, I'll bet Ernie knows more than he'll let on. You think he'll get better and show up with a shovel? I wouldn't put it past him. First, Mr. Williams, call me Laszlos. It comes from my first name, Lucas, and my last name, Miklos, okay? Buck agreed as they embraced in the small air terminal, and you must call me Buck. I thought your name was Cameron. My friends call me Buck. Then Buck it is. I want to take you to meet with the believers. Oh, Laszlo's, I'm sorry, I cannot. I'd love to, and maybe I will get back here and do that. But do you understand that I have been away from my wife for many months? Laszlo looked stricken. Yes, but, and that she is in her last couple of weeks of pregnancy? You're going to be a father? Splendid. And everything is fine except that this is the worst time. Well, you know that. Buck nodded. My father in law wanted me to discuss with you your role in the International Commodity Co op. Yes, Laszlo said, sitting and pointing to a chair for Buck. I have been reading what Dr. Benjuda says about it. It is a brilliant idea. What would we do without it? We would all die, and that is what the evil one wants, right? Am I not a good student? Do you see a role for yourself or your company? Cocked his head. I'll do what I can. My company mines lignite. It's used in power plants. If there is any call for it in the community of believers, I would be happy to be involved. Buck leaned forward. Laszlo, do you understand what it will mean when citizens of the global community are required to wear the sign of the beast on their hand, hand or head? I think so. Without it, they cannot buy or sell. But I do not consider myself a citizen of the global community, and I would die before I would wear the sign of the Antichrist. That's great, friend, Buck said. But do you see how it will affect you? You will not be able to sell. Your whole business and livelihood are built on a product you sell. But they need my product, so they will put you in jail and take over your minds. I will fight them to the death. You probably will. What I'm suggesting is that you look for another commodity to trade, something more internationally marketable, something your brothers and sisters in Christ need and will be unable to get when the mark of the beast is ushered in. Laszlo's appeared deep in thought. He nodded. And I have another idea, he said. I will build my lignite business and sell it before they quit buying from me. Great idea. It happens all the time, Buck. You make yourself so indispensable to your biggest client that it only makes sense that they buy you out. And who is the biggest client? Laszlo sat back and smiled sadly, but Buck detected a gleam in his eye. The global community, he said. And that is the end of chapter 19. Next, I'll be reading chapter 20. Thank you for joining me and have a wonderful day.